Okay. I am going to start tonight's topic myself as we wait for the rabbi to get out of his meeting. He's going to come and he's going to talk about Rodef Shalom. And he's going to talk some about the Reform movement, the Reform Jewish movement in Pittsburgh, and something very important called the Pittsburgh Compact that was part of the shaping of the Reform movement. But I want to share with you, not from Pittsburgh, another part, and actually an earlier part of the Reform story. The Jews that came to Philadelphia and New York were generally Orthodox or conservative. There was no such thing as a Reform movement, and I'm not sure that sects were as recognizable, the divisions with the Jewish community in the early days in New York and Philadelphia, but certainly there were Ashkenazi and Sephardic temples, and from the old country, a fairly rigid, old-style Judaism. At some point, Jews began to spread west, and they did here, but maybe even earlier than here, Cincinnati. Cincinnati is the birthplace of Reform Judaism. Now, why is it the birthplace? It's a funny reason. Cincinnati became one of America's most German cities early on. German merchants came out with the Ohio River, and hello, Rabbi. Come on. And I will let him pick up the story. I was just finishing up one personal experience I had with the beginning of Reform Judaism. We'll have that in a couple of minutes. Okay, thank you for coming. In Cincinnati, because it was a German city, it was also a logical place for a certain number of Jewish families to move. Were you going to talk about Reformism in Cincinnati at all, or just in Pittsburgh?
Go ahead.
Okay. So a group of Jews moved out to Cincinnati, but they moved out to Cincinnati. They wanted to go west, and in moving west, they were more assimilationist than people that would stay in New York. In other words, their whole attitude was wanting to fit in, wanting to be more part of the community. Why Cincinnati was a German community is what they knew. Somewhere along the way, Jews who were looking for a more American way of Judaism, and a Rabbi Stephen Wise, who's a famous person, came together. Rabbi Wise was in upstate New York, and he got into a fight with his congregation because his ideas were too radical. And somehow there was a reach out from Cincinnati to Rabbi Wise, and he ended up out in Cincinnati and shaped the beginnings of the Reform movement. And the Hebrew Union College, which now has branches in New York, LA, and Cincinnati, its first branch was in Cincinnati. Later on, the Reform organization moved to New York. But so you have this city that many people regard, I do, as kind of a southern city and German city, was also where what we're going to hear more about from the Pittsburgh viewpoint started. And I know this because one day we went, there's a museum on the Hebrew Union College campus in Cincinnati, and I went to it, and there's a bookstore. And in that bookstore, they had this nice book on the Jews of Cincinnati, which I bought. And this is where they talked about the way that this movement was shaped. And this was some years before the history that now Rabbi Young is now going to talk to us about. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry to be a few minutes late. As I imagine Michael told you, I was on my way from another commitment. I teach 11th graders on Tuesday nights from 6:30 to 7:30, and so I got over here as fast as I could. And it's wonderful to be sharing this history of Rodef Shalom and of Judaism, the Jewish presence in Pittsburgh, with you this evening. It's fitting because at Rodef Shalom we're celebrating our 150th anniversary year, our sesquicentennial year. I like to use that word. I first encountered the word sesquicentennial when I was in California. As Michael said, there were multiple campuses of Hebrew Union College, New York, Cincinnati, Los Angeles. I am a product of the Los Angeles campus, but I left my sunglasses in the car. Originally, I'm a product of Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up and spent my first 18 years at Washington Hebrew congregation. We lived actually in the suburbs, in the Maryland suburbs, where a lot of the membership had moved. Washington, D.C. follows the pattern of many urban centers where the Jews once lived in the city center, but have slowly but surely moved into the suburbs and into the farther out suburbs and are really, really disparate. Pittsburgh is unique in the still vibrant Jewish population near the city center. And so my congregation was not unlike Rodef Shalom in its history, but the population lived a good distance away. We had, when we went back to the downtown campus, which was not all that often, and I'm sorry to say, it was a half an hour drive. So I spent the first 18 years of my life in Washington, D.C., and grew up a Redskins fan, so watching my Redskins and my adopted team, my Steelers, lose the same day was a little bit tough on Saturday. But from Washington, I went to Chicago, where I attended Northwestern University, and got a degree in political science, so I'm going to go home and check up on the New Hampshire primary as soon as we're done this evening, and see if the pundits were right and Obama and McCain won, or if the people who cast their ballots early this morning were right, because that was the way that they were voting. The first 49 votes, I think, in the state of New Hampshire went the way they were expected to go. So from Northwestern, I went to Hebrew Union College, and I spent my first year in Jerusalem. As do most students, we have that first year to get our Hebrew up to speed and to experience Israeli life and culture, and then we come back to one of the 3 stateside campuses. Now, why would a nice Jewish boy from Washington, D.C. choose to go to the big bad world of Los Angeles? Because he married somebody who was getting her master's degree in Jewish education. And that program was offered at the Los Angeles campus, known as the Ria Hirsch School of Education. And so she got her Master's of Arts in Jewish Education in 2002, and since she's been here, has come to direct the program formerly known as SAGIS, the School of Advanced Jewish Studies, but is today known by its new name, J-Site, the Jewish Site for Innovative Teen Education. And if you like that name, I came up with it. If you don't, it had nothing to do with it. So I am now in my 4th year at Rodef Shalom congregation, first as an assistant rabbi, and then now as an associate rabbi, and I work alongside Rabbi Sharon Henry, who's a colleague as an associate rabbi, and the senior rabbi is Rabbi Aaron Bisno. And Rabbi Bisno and I started on the very same day, so it's been a 3.5 years of a very steep learning curve and a lot of change as the congregation has gotten used to us and we have gotten used to them. And so that's what leads me to be here this evening as somebody that you assume to be qualified in the history of Rodef Shalom. So I can speak from research and from story for the first 146.5 years of the congregation, and can speak from personal experience for the last 3.5. And I know that there are others in this room who have a longer knowledge and memory of the congregation than I do, and I hope that over the course of the evening you'll be able to pipe in and fill in the gaps that inevitably my presentation will have. So the Jewish community in Cincinnati, of which Rabbi Wise was the leader and really the founder of the institution, the major institutions of Reform Judaism, really found its, found its feet, found its footing in the latter half of the 19th century, with the 3 main institutions of Reform Judaism all being founded in the 1870s and 1880s. Jews arrived in Pittsburgh a little bit earlier than that. Many of you know that this year we're embarking on Pittsburgh's 250th anniversary. I don't know if that has a cool word like sesquicentennial. Does it? Does anybody know how you say
no one knows what it is.
250 in fancy speak?
There's a word for it.
I'm sure there's a word for it, and I'm sure we'll hear it from time to time. So Pittsburgh is embarking on its 250th year, and if we count that backwards, we get to 1758. Jews arrived in Pittsburgh some 80 years later, in the 1840s, was when the first real substantial Jewish community arrived in Pittsburgh. And the Jews who arrived in Pittsburgh did what Jews do when they arrive in a city with no Jewish presence, which is not formed a synagogue. I heard a voice back there. Dr. Fisher. Formed a cemetery. The first thing that they do before they get together to pray is they get together to bury people. And it was the cemetery, Beis Almon, which is a name given to Jewish cemeteries. It was formed in the 1840s, and it was only in the latter part of the 1840s that they organized and formed a synagogue. And the synagogue that they founded was not Rodef Shalom. If you're adept at math, you'll notice that we're celebrating 150 years. From 1848, 150 would be 1998. The congregation they formed was called Sharei Shemayim, which means gates of heaven. But unfortunately, Sharei Shemayim went to heaven, and after not very long, they merged with a congregation that came to be known as Rodef Shalom, which at its founding was spelled Rodeph, and apparently, and maybe you've had another presentation on this, Pittsburgh at the time was spelled without its H. So we added an H to Pittsburgh and took it away from Rodef Shalom, and everything came out in the wash, and today we're Rodef Shalom. So Rodef Shalom was founded finally and chartered in 1856. So somewhere between 1854 and 1856, they came up with the idea, they came up with the name of the synagogue, and in 1856, in November, the official charter was filed. So if you're adept at math, you'll also notice that we're celebrating our 150th anniversary a year late, but don't tell. That's our secret. It took us that long after the senior rabbi, Rabbi Bisno, arrived to get things organized, and it's paired with another significant anniversary, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The people who founded Rodef Shalom were not your typical population of synagogue founders, and the people who lived in Pittsburgh at the time varied quite substantially from the people who live in Pittsburgh today. I've been told, and again this is now probably third-hand anecdotal fact that I'm giving you, so it may or may not be true, that Allegheny County has the second highest median age of anywhere in the country. Second only to Miami-Dade. That's true? Okay. Pittsburgh in the 1850s was very different. Most of the people who founded Rodef Shalom congregation were approximately the age of the teenagers I just came from teaching. They were 16 to 21-year-olds who had set out for the frontier. Pittsburgh at the time was a frontier town, and they came as merchants and traders, and a lot of them came without their families. And so we today have the conversations of how do we keep our children interested after bar and bat mitzvah. Well, maybe you set them out and leave them without a Jewish environment at all and force them to make their own Jewish environment. And that's what the 16-year-olds and the 18-year-olds who were here did. They formed a community. Now, we also have to deal with the fact that the first thing they did was form a burial society, so some of them didn't survive, but they did form a community, and that community was Rodef Shalom. So a lot of the founders of Rodef Shalom were young. The community they founded in 1856 was an Orthodox congregation. So the first people who made their way out here banded together, and whether it was because they were all Orthodox or whether that was because that was the mode of Judaism that would allow them all to gather together, Rodef Shalom at its beginning was an Orthodox congregation. And it was that way for the first 7 years of its existence, until they made the brilliant decision, or the great mistake, depending on which side of the issue you fall upon, to invite Isaac Mayer Wise to come to Pittsburgh. And Isaac Mayer Wise was one of the great leaders of the Reform movement, and he was the rabbi who founded who was instrumental in the founding of the main institutions of the Reform movement: the Rabbinical Seminary, Hebrew Union College, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Association of Reforming Rabbis, and he was also instrumental in the founding of the movement of congregations, the formerly Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the Union for Reform Judaism. So Rabbi Wise came in 1863 and addressed the congregation, and shortly thereafter they said, hey, this Orthodox stuff isn't for us, and they became a Reform congregation and modified the services and the worship experience in a way befitting their newfound identity. So they changed prayer books and adopted both of the Reform prayer books that were current at the time, and in turn came to be one of the earliest Reform congregations. The decision of Rodef Shalom to become a Reform congregation preceded any of these institutions of Reform Judaism. The college being founded in 1876, through the last of these institutions, the Union for Reform Judaism, being founded in 1889. So Rodef Shalom was a charter member of the Reform movement, the organized Reform movement in America. The services at Rodef Shalom in the 1850s were conducted in Hebrew, when Hebrew was used, which became increasingly less over the course of its first 30 years, but also in German, because most of the Jews and most of the people of Pittsburgh at the time were of German or German-related descent, and so that was really the vernacular of people at the time, and the worship services were conducted in that fashion. It wasn't until 1893 that Rodef Shalom began to have services in English, and that was the leadership of the congregation prevailed upon Rabbi at the time to begin offering services in English, and so he solved it in the following way. He said, I don't particularly want to give my sermons in English, I'd rather give them in German, so I'm going to hire an assistant rabbi, and that rabbi will give sermons in English. And that's what happened. So we have now, in 1893, the first services in English, and that will continue to be the mode of worship at Rodef Shalom through the present day. And the rabbi that succeeded, that began to serve the congregation as senior rabbi in 1901, J. Leonard Levy, would give his sermons in English. He was an Englishman. It was only the natural thing to do. I think he would have had a hard time giving his sermons in German. But before we get into the 20th century, there's one more significant thing of note in the 19th century, and that is the first statement of Reform Judaism adopted in the United States was adopted in Pittsburgh. It was called the Pittsburgh Platform, and it was adopted in 1885. Now you might ask, why was Pittsburgh chosen to be the site where this document was adopted? Well, simply because it was in the middle of the Jewish world at the time. It was an easy train ride from Cincinnati, and it was an easy train ride from New York. I guess probably not so easy, but you could get there. And so everybody was able to gather in Pittsburgh, and it was hosted by Rodef Shalom congregation. The actual platform, however, wasn't signed there. It was signed or ratified or whatever you do with platforms at the Concordia Club, its location on the north side. So the site where this platform was adopted no longer stands, but there is, thanks to the Historical Society, not the Squirrel Historical Society, but the Greater Pittsburgh Historical Society, and I don't have their official name.
Western Pennsylvania.
Western Pennsylvania, thank you. There is now a marker commemorating the Pittsburgh platform's signing that was dedicated earlier this year. The Pittsburgh platform was a radical statement of Judaism. It parted in extremely significant and substantial ways from what has come to be known Orthodox Judaism. It emphasized rationality in all of religious practice, and It emphasized universalism, and it emphasized creating a Judaism that would comport with the lives of 19th century American Jews, liberal-minded Jews. And so a lot of the traditional liturgy was either abridged or excised because it was theologically difficult, and a lot of the ritual practices were abandoned and left to the side. So the idea of wearing a head covering or a kippah was left out at the side, and the idea of keeping kosher likewise. So what they held on to were a lot of the ethical teachings of Jewish tradition, and that came to be what defined the Reform movement would be its reliance upon ethics and its reluctance to embrace ritual. And so the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 is a very strong statement that defines the American Jewish landscape at the end of the 19th century. And so it was here, and so we take pride in the fact that Pittsburgh had such a significant role in the early years of the Reform movement. It doesn't have the lasting impact that Cincinnati had in terms of having a college campus there, but Pittsburgh nonetheless is one of the formative cities for Reform Judaism, and Rodef Shalom, one of the formative congregations. So we enter the 20th century, and in 1901, J. Leonard Levy becomes rabbi of Rodef Shalom, and the congregation is outgrowing its site downtown on 8th Street, which no longer exists, but is outgrowing its site, so they decide to build a new congregation on the very same property. And it's not long after they get into this new building in about 1905, it was a little bit of 1904, they realize that it's quickly becoming too small, and so they decide they need to acquire a new property. So they've now rebuilt the synagogue, and within a couple of years of rebuilding it are set to abandon it, which I think is a very hard decision that they came to, and a very courageous one, because they had already sunk as much money as they had into the building and into the property, and realized that it would no longer hold this greatly expanding congregation. And so they set out for a new place to build, because the current plot of land wouldn't accommodate the size of the synagogue they thought they needed. And so they looked on the north side, where most of the Jews who had moved out of the city lived, and decided not to build there. They decided to go elsewhere, where not a lot of Jews currently lived, but where there was potential and where there was where the next generation of growth would be. And so they moved to Oakland, to this little place at the corner of 5th and Morewood, and there they built a sanctuary. And that is where we are today. So the second anniversary that we're celebrating is the anniversary of Rodef Shalom's sanctuary, which was dedicated in 1907. And so now when we combine the charter in 1856 and the sanctuary in 1907, we're celebrating them both together, the sesquicentennial of the congregation and the centennial of our residence at the corner of 5th and Morewood. You know, and I'm taking a little bit of poetic license, because there actually was a house at the corner of 5th and Morewood that we didn't buy until much later, but more or less the corner of 5th and Morewood. You know, now where that open green spaces came along a little bit later, so the congregation grew very slowly. But in the fall of 1907, the first worship services were held in that sanctuary, and it would prove to be a good decision as the universities grew and as the Jewish population moved east instead of north, perhaps partially driven by where the congregation had built, but also just because that's where the significant population growth was. The congregation was well positioned to absorb this influx of new people, some of whom were immigrants from other countries, from Germany, and increasingly from Eastern Europe and other places, and some of them were people who were making the move from cities like New York and moving west. And so Rodef Shalom grew rapidly, and as the center of Reform Jewish life, if not the center of Jewish life in Pittsburgh, it became a community center. And I don't know if anybody here remembers it, because we're having a little bit of a discussion amongst the staff that this is I haven't seen any pictures of it, but I'm told that Rodef Shalom in the early part of the 20th century had a swimming pool and a gymnasium. And those have obviously since ceased operating. And the reason why they were closed down is because the JCC opened. So right across the street is the JCC, and the leadership of Rodef Shalom at the time felt that there should be one place where Jews would be able to gather and have their communal needs met, and so the swimming pool and the gymnasium at Rodef Shalom were shut down. And everybody was funneled into the JCC for those needs, and Rodef Shalom became a religious institution and not meeting those community center needs in the same way anymore. So Rodef Shalom came to be an intellectual center. I said early on that the 1885 Pittsburgh platform utilized a rational approach to Judaism. And Rodef Shalom became one of the greatest exemplars of that. One of the things that the rabbis, beginning with J. Leonard Levy and continuing on down the line, have been known for is scholarship. And so Rodef Shalom became a laboratory for the intellectual exploration of Judaism, both in terms of the sermons that would be delivered from the pulpit and the lectures, because beginning in the early part of the 20th century, in addition to Shabbat morning services, which were pretty sparsely attended, the congregation would have Sunday morning services. This is not to emulate the Christian Sabbath, but to respond to the reality of being a working person in the city of Pittsburgh, where there were 6-day work weeks, and Saturday was a work day, and if you were going to survive and earn a living, you had to work on Saturday, and so Sunday became a day that was free to attend to matters of the Spirit. And so, counter to some perceptions that are out there that in the early Reform movement, the Sabbath was observed on Sunday, that's not the case, but the Reform movement felt it appropriate and necessary to react to the reality of the time and offer something to those who could not get there on Saturday but instead came on Sunday. That said, the Sunday service became the larger service and the more significant service, and so that was when the big sermon of the week or the lecture of the week would be delivered. And so there are volumes and volumes in our archives of Rabbi J. Leonard Levy's Sunday lectures. We don't have anything from, we don't have very much from his Shabbat talks, but his Sunday lectures were the more significant community events, and those were the lecture topics that would be advertised in the Jewish newspaper, which was called the Jewish Criterion at the time. And so Rodef Shalom came to be an intellectual center, and that legacy would be passed on to his successor, Samuel Goldenson, from whom we have a lot less archival material because he didn't have the same insistence as J. Leonard Levy that everything be transcribed. So I was fishing for some sermons of his, and we actually have precious few of them, but we have virtually everything that Rabbi Goldenson's successor, Solomon B. Freehoff, ever said, wrote, thought, or dreamed about. That he had boxes and boxes and boxes full of stuff from Solomon Freehoff, and he is one of the most respected and revered rabbis in the history of Rodef Shalom, and carried forward the intellectual tradition, and he was responsible for Rodef Shalom's prominence in Reform Responsa, which is what I was studying with our 11th graders this evening. And responsa are exactly what they sound like, answers to questions. A quiz question. Responsa is plural, the singular being responsum. Just like data, which you don't often think of as a plural word, and singular is datum, responsa is a plural word, and singular responsum. So responsa literature, which are questions that are asked of rabbis, are not just of your own rabbi, your hometown rabbi, but of rabbis who are known to be especially learned. It was really centered in Reform at Rodef Shalom, because Rabbi Freehoff, or Dr. Freehoff, was very much involved in that project, and his successor, Dr. Walter Jacob, also did a lot of work in promulgating Reform Responsa. And so people from all over the country, and indeed all over the world, would write questions to Dr. Freehoff and Dr. Jacob, and they would answer them and publish them in collected volumes. So the one that we looked at today was actually from New Zealand, of all places, but it was written to the responsive committee for them to address, and it was about the modifications that Reform Judaism would make to the Jewish notion of a minyan, which is a prayer quorum. Traditionally in Judaism, 10 people are required to recite certain prayers, and Reform Judaism needed to address that concept of public prayer and make it from a Reform perspective rather than from the traditional Orthodox perspective. And I can get into how they answer that question if you like, but that's a tangent from where I'd like for us to go this evening. But Rodef Shalom has long been an intellectual center of Reform Judaism and of Judaism in America, which can perhaps best be seen by the book reviews that Dr. Solomon Freehoff gave. He would give these book reviews, I think in the fall. Here I'm a little bit fuzzy, but he would give them to the broader community. And our sanctuary, which seats 1,200, which was never full on Shabbat, would be full to overflowing with people of the congregation and people of the community to hear Dr. Freehoff review books. Dr. Freehoff loved Shakespeare, and he shared that love with others every chance he could get, and it became an overwhelmingly successful program, and it really helped Rodef Shalom and Reform Judaism become palatable to the mainstream culture. People respected him for his intellect and tolerated his religion. And so they would come into the synagogue and see that Jews don't do things that are all that scary. And so it helped to really build bridges and create a better environment for Jews in the city of Pittsburgh. And so one of the things that Reform Judaism and Rodef Shalom has offered is this sort of intellectual depth. Another thing that Rodef Shalom has been at the forefront is worship. If you've been to an Orthodox service, you may or may not have noticed that things move rather quickly, that there's a lot of liturgy that they cover, and that there's a lot that's repeated. And Reform Judaism modified a lot of the liturgy and took out a lot of the repetitions, and introduced a lot more worship in the vernacular, whether that be German at first, or then English. And Rodef Shalom has utilized and embraced all the prayer books of the Reform movement to date. We are in the process of discussing what to do with the new prayer book that has just been issued this past year. We haven't even received the copies that we ordered yet, so our discussion is perhaps a little bit premature. But the prayer books of the movement have all been in use of the congregation, and Dr. Freehoff, when he was chair of the liturgy committee, even worked in the production of some of them. And so Rodef Shalom has been an exemplar of Reform Jewish worship and what came to be known as classical Reform Judaism. When newer congregations began to be founded in the suburbs or in spin-off congregations in urban areas, they adopted more traditional liturgy, used more Hebrew, used music that fit the times in which they were created, whereas Reform Judaism still very much reflects the time in which it came to prominence, not when it was created, but when it came to prominence. And so at our services you will still find the organ in use, and although it's been diminishing over the last several years, you'll still find services at which there's a professional quartet or choir, and you'll still find a lot of what is not meant to be disparaging, that is called high church music, because it is grand music for the soloist. It's not participatory. It's not camp music, or as some people call that, happy clappy music. By any stretch of the imagination, it's music you listen to and appreciate, or at least we hope you appreciate it. And when Jews don't appreciate things, we hear about it. So there are. It's meant to be appreciated, not meant to be participatory. There, slowly but surely, Rodef Shalom is evolving to have more of a mix between participatory and performance-based music, but certainly we still have strong allegiance to our roots in this performance-based style of music. with significant organ, with loud organ and solo voice, or a quartet. So as a worship center, Rodef Shalom was at the forefront, and it's still a place where that style is practiced and respected. And so Rodef Shalom really became the center of Reform Judaism in Pittsburgh, and it grew and it grew and it grew. When they made the decision to build this new site, the corner of 5th and Morewood, the membership was somewhere in around 300 families. In the 1940s, membership had grown to its height of about 2,200 families. Again, due to immigration and due to from without and from within the United States, the congregation then was instrumental in spinning off other congregations in the city. The story that we tell at Rodef Shalom is that we grew too big for our own britches, as it were, and we couldn't have the community that we wanted with the 2,200 families that made up the congregation, and so we purposely started congregations like Temple Sinai, Temple Emmanuel, the South Hills, Temple David, and Rodef Shalom in the North Hills, all the Reformed congregations. So goes the Rodef Shalom version of the story. We're purposely spun off in the congregation. From what I gather, I'm not affiliated with Temple Sinai, but from what I gather, they tell a different story. And the story that they tell is that there was a group who was dissatisfied with the worship at Rodef Shalom and wanted something more contemporary, wanted a different experience that Rodef Shalom couldn't or wouldn't offer, and so they left and journeyed up the hill to Squirrel Hill. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and I'm not entirely sure why Temple Sinai started, but it did, and now there are 5 Reformed congregations in Greater Pittsburgh, and then as I was at a meeting last night, I'm reminded that there's another congregation in Greensburg, and there's a congregation in Wheeling. And so there are, if you draw the circle even
What
more.
are the other 3? What are the other 3 Reform?
Besides Temple Sinai, Rodef Shalom is in Allison Park, and is much younger. Temple David is in Monroeville, and they just celebrated 50 years. And Temple Emmanuel is in the South Hills, and they celebrated, and they're about that same age.
What's the name of the group that broke off from B'nai Israel?
Broke off from B'nai Israel. When B'nai Israel,
Oh, that was conservative.
right, when B'nai Israel finally ceased operations, a not insignificant number of their members came to Rodef Shalom. We have a lot of people who have B'nai Israel roots in their past, but I'm not well versed in when things spun off from there, what it became. So the story that we tell is that Rodef Shalom was instrumental in starting all those other Reformed congregations, and I'll stick by that. Rodef Shalom has long been known for its stable leadership, and indeed there have been precious few rabbis of Rodef Shalom. There are, even though I'm an associate rabbi of the congregation, I don't earn the title rabbi of Rodef Shalom. That's reserved for the senior rabbi. And I believe that Rabbi Bisno is the 9th rabbi of Rodef Shalom in its 150-year history. So we had, thankfully, many years of good service from J. Leonard Levy, from Samuel Goldenson, from Solomon Freehoff, who served, I believe, the longest, but just barely. He served 32 years as senior rabbi of the congregation. Walter Jacob followed as a close second with 30 years as senior rabbi of the congregation. Mark Stateman, and finally Aaron Bisno, who's been the senior rabbi since July of 2004. But we began the 20th century with the dedication of our building in 1907, with the arrival of J. Leonard Levy, who really brought the English service, but the century closed in 1999 with a significant event in Pittsburgh. And that was the Reform rabbis gathered again. When they gathered in 1885 in Pittsburgh, they numbered about 16. somewhere in that neighborhood. And when they gathered in 1999, it was many hundreds, and they gathered this time in the Rodef Shalom sanctuary for the annual meeting of Reform rabbis, and there they adopted what is now known as the Pittsburgh Principles, which is the most recent statement of Reform Judaism. So we have the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885, and the Pittsburgh Principles in 1999. They both are PP, so it's very difficult to keep them straight. There won't be a quiz afterwards. But in 1999, the most recent statement of what it means to be a Reformed Jew was passed in the sanctuary at Rodef Shalom, and there's a little plaque outside to commemorate it. And that statement was radically different from what they passed in 1885 at the Concordia Club, because it reflected the growing embrace of traditional practices once discarded by the Reform movement. And so it embraced the spiritual journey and the ability to chart a Jewish path of meaning that the rabbis of 1885 would have rejected out of hand. And we reflect that journey as well. If you come to Rodef Shalom now, either for a Friday night or a Saturday morning, you will see members of the congregation who wear kippot or yarmulkes, where you wouldn't have just maybe 15 years ago. The story is told that if a Jew came in wearing a kippah, the usher would go around and ask them to kindly remove their hat. Well, we do have some standards. So today, kippot are present in the congregation. Certainly not everybody wears one, nor do we ask them to, but there is an acceptance of the diversity of religious practice that was not characteristic of the Reform movement 100 years ago. And the same thing with the wearing of the talit or other ritual clothing, and the same is true with keeping kosher. It was a practice that was flat out rejected in 1885, but now is something that's part of the panoply of practice, to use more P's, the panoply of practice of Reformed Jews in the 21st century. And so the 1999 platform is a significant journey in the 114 years between statements of Reformed Judaism, and really charts us towards a Judaism that's really open to a diversity of people. Not all Reformed Jews look alike, practice in the same way, but hopefully we all approach questions in a similar fashion, which is looking at the ancient rituals critically and assessing them for their validity in the modern day and in our own lives. That's really the hallmark of Reformed religious practice, is this notion of informed choice, of learning about Jewish tradition and then choosing how we're going to reflect it in our own communities and in our own individual lives. And so now we enter the 21st century, and we get to this year, 2008, and we look at our congregation and see a diversity that didn't exist at its founding. We see that we encompass families from all different descents. We have not only people from Germany and people from Poland, but we have people from other parts of Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and members who were part of Jewish communities in Iran and other places throughout the world. And we have interfaith families in our midst, and in a significant step for the congregation are now our rabbis do officiate at same-sex wedding ceremonies, and we've done a few of them in the last 3.5 years, but we become a congregation that seeks to be warm and welcoming to all different practices of Judaism. So we no longer ask people to remove their hats, and my parents tell the story of when they came to Rodef Shalom 20 years ago with friends of theirs from Detroit. They came because they wanted to say the prayer of memorial, to say Mourner's Kaddish with this couple from Detroit. And they sat down in this 1,200-seat sanctuary, and before long somebody came and tapped them on the shoulder and said, "You're in the Rebbitzon's seat." Rebbitzon is the rabbi's wife, so gently moved over, so that the Rebbitzon could have her seat. Of course, she never showed up. But we have tried very hard to make Rodef Shalom a much more inviting place to be. Certainly the building is still somewhat imposing. It's beautiful, but it's imposing for a first-time visitor. But our aim is to make the to lower the barriers to religious participation and to welcome a wide array of Jewish journeys into our midst. And so that's where we are today. I'd be happy to hear your questions or comments, and thank you for that.
I suspect that Rabbi Wise brought with him from Europe some of his basic ideas about what became Reform Judaism. Can you comment on that?
Well, what he brought with him was some of the intellectual rigor that would be used, and would be an understanding that would grow in favor that that religion had to comport with reason and science in a way that it had not been subjected to in the past. Because as science advanced, scientific understanding, those who studied science looked at the world differently. And the old religious worldview didn't respond, didn't work. And so they had to come up with a new framework. And really the journey of the 19th century is science and religion in dialogue, at least in the liberal world. And that was the process that he brought with him. He brought with him a commitment to worship that made sense to the vernacular. So he brought with him German as a valid form of prayer. I mean, those were some of the things that really they brought with him as a genesis for what would become the Reform movement. Yes. Back.
In the early days of Reform Judaism, rabbis were referred to as reverend
Yes.
so-and-so. Do you know how that came into practice and why it ended?
Well, it came into practice. I will say, if you go to Rodef Shalom, if you come on January 27th at 10:30 in the morning, you'll see the finale of our January series, which is our religious school program, studying which this year is studying the history, the 150th anniversary of the congregation, history of the congregation. You'll see me dressed up in a robe and in a priestly collar, because if you go down the paintings of the rabbis of the congregation, you'll see rabbis who were wearing the priestly collar. Now, they did that because Reform Judaism, remember in 1885, was very much concerned with with intellectual rigor and also with universalism and looking like what the others did. Why do we have the organ? Because churches do, and the objections that Jewish tradition would raise to it weren't compelling. And it's not to say that Jewish tradition didn't have anything to say about it, because it does have something to say about instrumentation on Shabbat. But the rabbis weren't compelled. It was a time when difference was not embraced. And in order to be a player in American society, in order to climb that ladder of success, you needed to be palatable to the people who made the rules. And the people who made the rules weren't the Jews. There are people who would argue otherwise, but trust me, it wasn't the Jews. And so, there were compromises, or to put it generously, that were made in order to have Judaism appear in a way that would be palatable. And that's why the ritual decisions were made in the way that they were, because nobody in the Christian church would wear a head covering, so Jews in Reform congregations didn't either. And so the term reverend was adopted for religious leaders, for rabbis, because it changed the title, but as I'm forgetting who said this to my wife, but somebody said it to my wife, titles are cheap. It's what they stand for. The work that a rabbi didn't change, the title did. And reverend has in it revere, and rabbi has in it teacher, so it's not a name antithetical to the work that a rabbi does. It strikes us in the modern, 100 years later, as kind of odd, but it was a compromise that they felt that they could make without losing what they believed to be the integrity of the tradition. Now, why did it stop? Because ever since 1885, we've been reclaiming the traditions that they rejected. And so as Judaism became more part of the common culture, it became more appropriate to use the term rabbi. And so by the time J. Leonard Levy came 16 years after the Pittsburgh platform, he was known as rabbi.
I have one question and one comment. Is it possible to pinpoint the time when Rodef Shalom ceased to be German and became more generalized?
1893.
1893.
That was when they hired the assistant rabbi who would give sermons in English.
Oh, no, but I mean, I was thinking more about the membership.
The membership.
Yeah, for example, after the 1880s, when large numbers of Eastern European Jews came to America, did Rodef Shalom get a lot of those people, or did they tend to form their own Orthodox congregations?
By the time they got to Pittsburgh, it was a little bit later in the 1880s.
Yeah.
There's a joke that if the world ends, Pittsburgh's a good place to be because news will get here about 10 years later. But Beth Shalom, which is celebrating about 90 years, became a place that a lot of Eastern European Jews would go. And it was later than that. And I don't know with any great conviction when Eastern European Jews began to populate Rodef Shalom more. But the decision to move to English instead of German was a big step in that direction. I just don't know when it actually took root.
Well, now I had one comment too. You mentioned the swimming pool, the gymnasium. Now, I have heard these stories too, but by the time I attended services and religious school, they were long gone, and this had been turned into an all-purpose meeting room, banquet hall, and that sort of thing. And it was roughly where it was in a separate wing, roughly where the main entrance and the gift shop are now. And this wing itself was actually demolished, I think in the mid-50s when they started an expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So it did happen, but it's impossible to find now.
But if you smell real carefully, you can still smell the chlorine. Yes.
What year did they close it? What year was that? Swimming pool. What year was it they closed it?
I believe it was the 1920s. I don't think it was in operation for all that long before the JCC came to be. But I'm a little bit shaky on that.
Okay.
Before I got there in 2004.
Yeah, I know. No, I didn't know when they even had one. I didn't know they had one. That's all.
Yes.
The Pittsburgh platform was signed at the Concordia Club on the north side.
Right.
Why and what was the Concordia Club at the time? I mean, I know what it is now.
It was the Jewish Dining Club and
The Jewish
Dining Club.
Dining.
And why? Because food's a part of what Jews do. And why wouldn't a document like that be signed in a house of worship? That's a great question, and I don't know if it was purposeful or accidental that they finally reached agreement on the main points over dinner, and so there's where there's where it was, and somebody had a pen handy and they signed it there. I don't know whether it was significant, a deliberate choice to sign it outside of the synagogue, or whether it was accidental. I'm going to tell the story that I would be in English class, and my English teacher would say, what do you think the author had in mind when he wrote this? And well, maybe nothing. Maybe there's no significance to it. We can read a lot into it, but I'm not sure that there is.
Well, the Concordia Club, as I know, and not being from Pittsburgh, was very German. Am I correct about that?
Well, yes, and so was the movement at the time. The Eastern European Jews who would have been here would have been few in number and would have been Orthodox, by and large, because they didn't have the benefit or the hindrance of that intellectual scientific stream. That wasn't part of their world in Eastern Europe. And so they knew the traditional Judaism, and they came to progressive liberal Judaism much later. Not to mention that things were in German, and that would not have been welcoming to them. But it was a German-American Judaism.
But they weren't particularly welcome anyway.
No, no, they weren't. They were viewed. I mean, that was some of the elitism, the snobbery of German Jewry was that they felt themselves to be better than Eastern Europeans. So no, they wouldn't have been particularly welcome in the congregation either, and that barrier took some time to erode. And there was a time in the Jewish world where an intermarriage was a German Jew marrying an Eastern European Jew. You chuckle, that's true. And that barrier slowly eroded. So, but in 1885, it was certainly German Jews. Yes, question? Yes.
You said that in the 1840s, for the earliest Jewish immigrants that came to Pittsburgh founded a cemetery,
Yes.
acquired, organized a cemetery. Do you know if it was in the downtown area or Oakland, or do you know where it was? And also, where are the Jewish cemeteries now? Does Rodef Shalom still have a
Rodef Shalom has a
cemetery?
cemetery. We had a cemetery in the first years of the congregation's operation in Troy Hill, which is called Troy Hill Cemetery, but we don't bury there anymore. We now
But
have.
it's still a Jewish cemetery?
Oh, yes, it's still Jewish cemetery, and there's a caretaker. Basically, there's somebody who lives on site at the congregation and takes care of it, and people still occasionally, although less frequently, come to visit. We now operate Westview Cemetery, which is right off 279 up north, and there are lots of Jewish cemeteries throughout the area. A lot of the ones that we go to now are either Westview up 279, or they're in Millvale.
I know there's one in Gibsonia.
Yeah, Temple Sinai's Memorial Park is in Plum. There's some on the
So
south
they're in
side.
sort of outlying
They're
areas.
all over the place, and there's a Jewish section in Homewood Cemetery, but that's not a Jewish cemetery. As to where the first cemetery was, I have to imagine it was pretty close into downtown, because
Yeah,
there wasn't much to the city.
yeah,
in the
because there aren't
1840s.
any cemeteries at all in
And
the downtown area.
and I don't know, maybe some others do know whether it's still in existence. I don't have it.
It's a little complicated, but there was a lot of comment about pre-World War II Germany of the assimilation tendencies, a lot of the Jewish community. We talked tonight about a Jewish community that didn't assimilate so much as adjust to and accommodate. Is there any common thread, or were these two things that developed completely differently, Germany only in the 20th century, or was it there before?
Well, I think that there was a belief formed by the experience of history that if you could show yourself to be less different, less threatening, that you stood a better chance of being welcomed. And these people were exceptionally knowledgeable both of Jewish law and of Jewish history, that people don't like the Jews because they do weird things. And so they were reading the newspapers and reading about the pogroms in Russia, and they were reading about other places where Jews were threatened simply because they were Jewish, and they said, well, the solution to this is not to compromise on what for us is essential, and we can look at their Judaism and say, well, there wasn't much to it, and some people do. But for them, it was holding on to what was essential, which is the ethical obligations of Judaism, without anything that might be seen as threatening, having it look as much like what you do. And so, for a long time in Reformed congregations, and Rodef Shalom among them, bar mitzvahs were not observed. Confirmation was the ritual that Jewish teenagers had up until 1966 at Rodef Shalom. And that was when the first bar mitzvah was. At least in a while. They probably had them in the 1800s, but for a long time we only did confirmation because that was what the Christians did. And so, I think there's a lot in common with the effort that was ultimately futile in Germany for Jews to blend in. I mean, I think they're very much related. I think that the outcome is very different. But I think that a lot of the same reasons that led to Jews being almost accepted in society until Hitler came along, led to it here. It's the same impulse, same thought process.
Couple more questions.
Can you tell us more about the, with the Pittsburgh platform? How large was this body and who these people were that came together?
They were somewhere around, we know the number, but I don't offhand, 16 to 20 Reform rabbis from places like Albany and New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Cincinnati and Chicago who met here over a period of a few days. And so they were leaders of congregations identified as Reform, and so they were liberal, rational, scientific-minded folk who interpreted Jewish tradition through the particular lens of modernity, and sought to have a Judaism that could be both authentic and Jewish enough, and yet be palatable to your average citizen, your average American citizen.
Were the local people the people who brought all these people together? Were they the originators of this idea, or Pittsburgh platform?
No, the rabbis decided it would be a good time to get together, to really, because up until then, remember, there was no central organization, and so there really wasn't a unifying, the congregation in Chicago wasn't bound to the congregation in Philadelphia by any real articulated ideology. And so they came together to try and create that ideology to which all dozen and a half of them could subscribe and take back to their communities and use as a guiding principle to create some cohesiveness and unity to a group of people who were of like mind, if not like practice yet. And so it sort of evolved. And then 10 years later, there was a prayer book that the Union of American Hebrew Congregations put out in the Central Conference of American Rabbis. It was called the Union Prayer Book. And so that became the first liturgy that the movement offered its members as a way to standardize the experience and to create of liberal Judaism a movement, a group of people who thought the same way and spoke the same way and really reflected the similar ideas in different cities. And so that was the effort in 1885.
Did I hear you say that Rabbi Bisno was the only one that was to be called Rabbi? What do your students call you?
Well, there's a title called Rabbi of Rodef Shalom, which was originated in a time before they had assistant rabbis. And so when you talk about the legacy of the Rabbi of Rodef Shalom, that's a title. He's the senior rabbi, but he's also the Rabbi of Rodef Shalom. And I guess I'm Rabbi in lowercase. They call me Rabbi, but
Assistant Rabbi.
Right, they call me the associate rabbi. The students call me Rabbi, and I don't mean to portray that I'm anything less than a rabbi, but there is this prestige associated with the position of senior rabbi that can't be ignored. Their assistants have come and gone, but the rabbis who have led that congregation, who have been the senior rabbi of the congregation, have been immortalized. And if you sit in the right place in Levy Hall, which is our alternative worship space, used to be a concert hall, but has we use it on Friday nights. If you sit in the right place, a few of them will even look at you from your seat because their portraits hang on the corridors, and some of them are positions that they actually look in. It's kind of creepy, but my portrait won't hang there. So there is a certain amount of prestige and honor afforded the senior rabbi. So and part of that is the title of Rabbi of Rodef Shalom.
Thank you very much. Couple things as we wrap up. Please take membership forms, sign up. I have one correction. I said Stephen Wise. That was a rabbi later in New York. I did not have the right Wise name. I brought the German thing up because it's something I lived through with my parents, German Jews, having to flee Germany. They were in Berlin in the 20s and 30s. They were actually Jewish mayors, and the assimilationism, mixing in seemed to work.
And my father went to a school, a 400-year-old school run by the French Huguenots, French Protestants. And I found out much later that that high school was called the Jewish High School of Berlin, because it was the best school in town, and where else would the Jewish community go to? It didn't matter what the religion was. I took you away from the primary. McCain has been declared the winner, and Obama and Clinton are much closer than the press suggested, and no one knows anything yet. So that's your beginning of politics. Thank you, and stay around for a little while. See us next month. We'll talk about Chatham with Beth Rourke, our good friend, and the fire department in March. And we're glad to see you, and Happy New Year again.
Yeah, but that's-